Assalamu alaikum, friends of BookBytes. We're coming to the end of our year and we've been spoiled with special treats in terms of the incredible wealth of memoir coming out of our South African literary space. And I have a special treat lined up for you this evening where we get to speak to the author of his personal memoir, Professor Jonathan Jansen, with Breaking Bread. We will be, in a way, breaking bread in a philosophical sense this evening. And, not needing much introduction, Professor Jansen is a distinguished professor of education at Stellenbosch University, the eldest son of a preacher and a nurse. He grew up on the Cape Flats in a conservative evangelical church, which shaped his values, he says, for good and bad. He was a biology teacher in the Cape before studies abroad, then returned to leadership in South African universities. Relieved of admin, he now does what professors are supposed to do. Think this is a man who has contributed hugely to so many sectors of society that to be able to sit with a copy of Breaking Bread when he's written in numerous genres, contributed to knowledge making in the country, is quite a special treat. And this evening, I just want to say, without further ado, welcome to Book Bites, Professor. It's wonderful to have you on the show. Welcome this evening.
Thank you. It's a great privilege.
So, right at the outset, I have so many questions having just finished this, reading this memoir. It takes great vulnerability. We can write academically, we can write from a research and a reporting point of view, but the depth and the raw emotion and the vulnerability that goes into writing memoir. Where did this begin for you in terms of the writing, and what has the experience been like for you, delving so deeply and sharing so beautifully?
Thank you very much. Yeah, so, I don't think my primary and high school experiences provided, anything uh, spectacular. As I say in the book, I was largely bored, was middle of the class for a long time in terms of academic, achievement. And then, a number of things happened, including an amazing teacher who basically convinced me that I was smarter than I thought, and ever since then, especially going to university and especially studying in America, I discovered that the longer I studied, the longer I stayed in school, the better I became at things like public speaking, things like writing, and so on and so forth. So obviously, initially, writing was very, very difficult. You spend, you know, many hours just staring at a blank page and so on. And then I discovered I had breakthroughs, one is which was people who gave me very hard feedback on my writing. And I remember one that made me very sad when, with a fellow graduate or postgraduate student in California, I mean, this guy was also a professor now. Basically, said, your writing is so incredibly uh, you know, uh, uh, disconnected from people. It uses jargon. It you're trying to be smart. Why don't you write the way you speak? Why don't you write so that people not only understand you but feel you? If you know what I mean. And ever since then, I started to write, and the moment I started to enjoy it, when it became like eating and drinking to me, I seldom went through a day in which I didn't spend two, three, four, five, sometimes more hours just writing. Then people started to ask me to write for newspapers. Now, that, as you said, is a particular audience. It's a particular kind of writing. You can't use words like epistemology or, such ridiculous words. You must just speak to people, about what's happening in education in the country. So that was a particular form of writing I enjoyed. Then I, of course, wrote for academic journals, but then I had to, write for school children, and try and inspire them through my writing, like in the book, writing letters to my children, for example. So what I learned was how to write for a newspaper, how to write for children, how to write for adults, how to write for, stuffy academics. And as I said, the more I wrote, the more it became a way of writing myself out of trouble. What do I mean by that? You see, I seldom plan a book by writing it in advance, by sketching different chapters. I write, and as I write, I think, and as I think, I'm able to resolve a whole lot of things in my head and in my heart. And so Breaking Bread is very much that kind of book.
I think, I love hearing about writer's process because there's a recipe that forms in the mind. As much as you're not planning out those scenes, there's a kind of process happening inside because the writer is so much an instrument as part of the process. And there's something also very spiritual about the way in which you carry out these scenes in Breaking Bread, not just reaching into the past, but making sense of it as you go along. I get a sense of that as well. How much, in the broader sense, does family and religion shape who we become and where we go in the world? Because it's not just that you're saying this is a structure that presses upon you. You're also very engaged in your thought processes around how you shape yourself, how we shape identity. Maybe comment on some of that.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because you see, when you're a columnist and you're writing, I've been writing now for 15 years, right? As a columnist for the Times, every Thursday, your article appears. Every Wednesday by noon, you should put that article into, you know, drop it with the with the editors. So how do you write every Wednesday by noon for a Thursday print for 15 years? This is how it happens. I had to learn very quickly how to be observant, how to take in things around me, how to see in the ordinary the extraordinary, how to. So, can I give you an example of that? I'll give you a very quick example of that, which also fits in with the themes in Breaking Bread. So, because I was reared as an evangelical Christian fundamentalist, on top of that, everything was black and white. The Muslims are going to hell, the Anglicans are going to hell, the Catholics are going to hell, except us. Okay. Now, obviously, I'm deeply embarrassed, to be honest with you, that I even thought that way. But it was very important for me to think my way out of that kind of dilemma. So, at the school where I work at on the Cape Flats as a turnaround specialist, I do a lot of things. I help the principal and the team to turn around the school, but I also connect with the children. And one way in which I connect with them, apart from teaching them as a old science teacher, I take them to the dentist when they have dental pains. And one day, a grandfather stops at the school gate where I stand every morning to welcome the kids. And he says, my daughter Yusra, uh, she's having incredible dental pain. Can you please help her? So I said, no worries, sir. Leave her with me. So I took her to the dentist. And to cut a very long story short, um, they eventually filled the four teeth, and Yusra you know, was healed and felt incredibly. I could see she was smiling all the way back to school. Anyway, I paid for it. She didn't pay a cent. And the next morning, a grandmother, she's raised by two incredible grandparents. And a grandmother's there in tears in the principal's office. She says, Professor, you have no idea what change you've made in this kid's life, right? And can you come for dinner? Now, the dinner, of course, I said yes. I was so excited. And so I go to Yusra's home and I get there. And then now I understand why they told me to come at 4 o'clock, because it's in a very heavily ganged area. And you must come in at 4 and get out at 6. Okay, you want to live. I go into that house, there's nothing there. So my eyes are observing everything. I see a lot of fish tanks of all things, but I don't see a lot of other, what you normally see in a house. So I realize this family is struggling, and I'm saying to myself, where's the food going to come from? And I'm saying to myself, why is Yusra standing there so proud, so smiling with a full school uniform at 4 in the afternoon, right? Suddenly they bring the buba, and the buba was amazing. Then they brought the ruchi and the curry, and it was probably the best I've ever eaten. And then the lights go off because they didn't have enough money for the electricity box, and I'm trying to take their attention away from it so that they know I'm not embarrassed by this, I'm just happy. And there's this Putakasim at the other side of the table, and yes, sits the child of evangelical parents, you know, and in that moment, I was probably the happiest you've ever seen me, breaking bread with a Muslim family, whose daughter Yusra is in my school, who's just wanting to say thank you. You know, at 6 o'clock, they hurry me up, take me to my car, and say, "You got to get out of here before the bullets fly." You know, that was the implication. I get home 20 minutes later, 25 minutes later, and my phone pings, right? And guess what? It's Yusra on the phone, and Yusra says, "Did Sir get home safe?" I can't tell you how much I cried, you know. Now, why am I telling you this story? Partly because it changed me so enormously, but partly to say the way I write was to everything that was happening. I'm taking it in through all my senses, my nose, the taste, the ears, the eyes. All the senses work together to compose a story. And that story obviously is a story I will tell in another book, you know. So this is the joy of writing. To write well as a columnist, to write well as an academic, by the way, you have to be able to take in the world around you and see the beauty in our people. And that inspires me enormously.
And it definitely comes through. I mean, in Breaking Bread, you've got so many beautiful anecdotal references to the experiences that you've had. But there's also this, going back to the past, because we're able to draw so much on memory through memoir and going and create relatability through that writing, which you do. Um, I look at how South Africa inherently is a violent society, and we draw on the violence of the past. And poverty is a form of violence that continues to this day. Um, but there's also the sense of, you talk about incidents of corporal punishment in the old schooling system that you encountered and how that has changed today. So, how have disciplinary measures changed, and what does it mean for society today? Because you existed in the status of the past and you very much involved in various sectors currently.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. You know, when my friends overseas ask me, tell me about the book, you know what they pick up on? The South Africans don't pick up on. They pick on the routines of punishment, you know, and they obviously worried about the incredible injustice, the incredible pain, the incredible memory, you know, that being randomly and regularly beaten up for the most, you know, simple of and innocent of mistakes. And so, yeah, that shapes you, you know. And I have to say, when I was a young adult, I thought that's the way you deal with problems, you know. You commit corporal punishment against kids. Of course, I no longer do that, and my wife and I didn't raise our children with any, beatings, because we learned something very important, and that is the difference between punishment and discipline. Punishment, often in our very apartheid afflicted society, is about committing physical pain against people you don't like, children who are disobedient, and that kind of thing. But discipline is something else. And the most important form of discipline is love, right? And if you, as I do with 1,236 kids in this school, if I can convince them that I'll walk through a wall for them, if I can convince them through the duty and the devotion with which I teach, then I can change their minds, you see, without having to lift a hand. And so, unfortunately, in our society, which is, as you said, very violent, people only know one way in which to resolve differences or disagreements, and that is through the infliction of pain. And so, part of what we have to unlearn, okay, is those disciplinary measures by which rule our lives as adults. Because if we don't, then the children we have today will do the same thing to their children, will do the same thing to their children, and we'll never get out of this spin. So I repeat, the most important form of discipline, and it's very effective, is love. And when you exercise that with a child from very early on, you can change their minds about how to relate to those with whom they disagree or from whom they differ.
Prof, you've also shown us so many examples of love in the public space, which is in the form of social justice. You've taken on various of these sort of incidences that have come through in your life, and you speak about that in Breaking Bread and some of your other works as well. The case of, recently in Limpopo, we dealt with a situation, or currently, they're dealing with the situation of a farmer, or a farmer and his farm hands who um, murdered two women on their farm who had gone to pick up expired yogurt and expired dairy products. And that case is currently running at the Mankweng court. You dealt with the case of the Reeds racism situation at UFS. Quite an unlikely and unprecedented way of dealing with it, with so much of your intention of connectivity comes through in how you dealt with it. Speak to us about that case, the difficulties you face, and how you so beautifully turned that around and led them through the darkness, so to speak.
Yeah, so I must tell you, I've picked up snippets from the Limpopo case with these farmers, and it's absolutely devastating, I have to say, that people could do that, behave that way. In the case of the Free State, of course, these were four young boys near the end of their undergraduate studies who knew the five workers, black workers whom they abused. And the more I studied that problem, the more I realized that not only were they culpable, but that the whole university, the whole institution was culpable. They gave them an award for that video that they made of abuse, etc. And so, as my white colleagues tried to tell me, oh, these are four bad apples, the more I realized it was a bad institution. In other words, now, of course, I had written in Knowledge in the Blood before, as you probably know, about how white youth, in this case, Afrikaans speaking white youth, acquire knowledge about the past. They didn't live under apartheid, most of them, but they behaved as if they were there. And once I understood how they got this troubled knowledge through their churches, through their peer groups, through their schools, primary and high school, through their cultural clubs like the Voortrekkers, etc., and through their churches. Once I understood that all those socializing agencies work in the same way to produce within them a very bitter and dangerous knowledge of themselves and others, I realized you can't just deal with these four kids. You also had to deal with the institutions that formed them. Okay, they weren't born that way, as Nelson Mandela reminds us. Nobody's born racist, right? You become that way because of these signal influences in your life. And so for me, it was important to understand that. And once I had understanding, of course, they were held responsible, as you know, through the courts and so on. But I also said, bring these boys back to campus, okay? Put them in classes in which they can learn to be different, right? And you know who understood that? Julius Malema. He came into my office, as you might recall from the book, and said, Prof, you did the right thing because they are going to do the same thing if you let them loose on the farms, like these farmers you just spoke about, right? So the university is one place in which you can interrupt that very dangerous knowledge, turn around, the minds of those young people of 17, 18 years old, and give them a much better future based on love and respect and so on, as opposed to racism and bitterness, etc. And that should apply, I think, across society, but especially with young people, you know, etc. Fortunately, I think if you look at South Africa today, 30 years later, I think most of those more vicious, I mean, we will still have this, sadly, into the future. You can't wipe out within 30 years what has been with us for 3.5 centuries, but there is much progress, and I see that among young people, black and white. And so I'm a lot more optimistic. But when these things do happen, as they will, we have to deal with them with understanding and not simply throw people in prison and throw away the key. That's not going to resolve anything.
I think it becomes so easy for perhaps politicians or community leaders or even religious leaders sometimes to manufacture fear in order to create division. And to be able to appeal to the youth and their sense of humanity is a very seminal thing that you've managed to do, to be able to change them from within and to change the structures from within. Because, like I said, when we see examples like this farm incident, for example, it just reminds you, you think you're moving forward, and then it reminds you that as a society, we still have cancerous kind of racism within us, and we still have to deal with it. You also pick up on
No?
xenophobic reactions within the academy,
Yeah.
and not just towards not just towards professors coming in and leadership in terms of knowledge, but also students. Tell us about some of that.
Yeah. So in a way, the racism you saw with rates at the University of the Free State and the racism that you saw, this horrible racism in Limpopo, that's easy racism. By which I mean you see the evil and you can deal with it, right? But a lot of our racism is polite. A lot of our racism comes at us with a smile, and with a suit and a tie. And xenophobia is like that, especially in the context of universities. So, Precious Simba, who's a colleague of mine at Stellenbosch University, she's Zimbabwean by origins, and I've just put out a book called Academic Xenophobia. And it speaks about how universities, with a smile, act in ways that really denigrate and undermine foreign nationals, particularly African foreign nationals, and we've documented empirically how that happens and with what consequences. So yeah, I think it's important not to only think of racism as something that happens on a farm or in a township, but racism that also happens in the everyday operations of an academy, of the university, but with a smiling face.
As much as you've been of the leadership in form or in terms of transformation within higher education or schooling systems, what are your sort of key recommendations to the rest of us? Where to from here, and how do we enhance transformation in various sectors of society?
So I think the most important is where all of us start, which is in the home. The most important is for parents to expose their children early enough to experiences with others. So, for example, even though, I grew up, and my wife and I grew up as fundamentalist Christians, when our children opened their eyes in their home, they saw Uncle Tahir Sali, they saw Uncle Ibrahim Rasool, they saw our Jewish friends, they saw our gay friends, they saw, in other words, by the time they were teenagers, they were surprised and shocked that racism even existed, religious bigotry, etc. So don't wait for the school to sort your kids out, right? It is really important in the years ahead of school and even when kids are in school to demonstrate to them that the table on which you break bread is open to everyone, regardless of what they believe and how they believe, how they pray, etc., etc. Because if you don't do that, it's very difficult. Just trust me on this as a university professor and vice chancellor by the age of 18 to try and change their minds, and to try and make them respectful towards women, respectful towards foreign nationals, respectful, you know what I mean? And so on. So I mean, for the purpose of this program, I would say start with where in the home. And I mean, just think of it. Just read books to your kids that are not narrow, that are broad, that are inclusive, that have people of color in it, that have more women as heroes. You know what I mean? And in that way, you already build a foundation that will stand them in good stead when they get to school and university.
And I think trends are changing in terms of the kind of conversations that are being had at home, and the kind of themes that are being held. And I think children, our generation, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, are questioning more about how they observe the world, how they intercept the world. And I'm hopeful that those conversations are being carried back and forth between home and school, and that we can enhance our society and our communities that way as well.
I hope you're right because I don't think you unlearn racism by osmosis. You know what I mean? It has to be an active process in which we confront these young people. I've always amazed. I used to always say to my first year students, "Why did you come to university? You come and you already believe everything. You know you're right about everything." I said, "The university is a place in which we destabilize you, in which your most cherished beliefs about yourself and others are put under the microscope. So I as I said, I hope you're right, but I still believe there is a place for all of us because in a way everything we do is educational, right? So whether you're the imam in the mosque or the priest in the church or the parent in the home, all of us are actually teaching. And the most powerful way to teach is through the example we set rather than through the words we use.
You've traveled the world and the breadth and depth of our country. you've taken so much of your learnings from the world, brought it back home, and spread it across the world. So I think in many ways, your intentions have carried you through. I almost felt when I was reading Breaking Bread, like there was this dotted line, and you can call it serendipity or spirituality, but there was this thread of how everything just came to you at the right time and the right place. And I thought that was incredibly, incredibly special. How does that, speak to us about how you make sense of that as a leader in
Yeah.
your position and as a spiritual being in your own way?
Yeah, we were just talking about this with friends over lunch today, and that is the remarkable coincidences, it would seem, that just at the right time, I grew up on the Cape Flats, right? The chances of a kid there going to university is very, very low, especially those days. And the chances of surviving beyond the age of 21 was very low, it still is. And so I wonder at the amazing, when you look back at the arc of your life, I really wonder, how did all of this happen? How was I so incredibly lucky that every time there was an aunt or there was you know, a man with registration money for university, or an uncle who drove me back to campus after I walked off campus, and that kind of thing. And you had all these aunties, all these people in the church, all these people in the community that played a role in shaping you. Now, the first consequence of that is you can't be arrogant. You can't imagine that this is because you worked hard or you're smart. It's because so many people made you possible. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. I do see a spiritual line of continuity there, that despite myself, there were so many people that made me possible. That keeps my feet firmly on the ground and deeply grateful, but it also energizes me to do the same for those who are less privileged.
Prof, it was so fantastic to have this opportunity to speak to you, especially after having just read Breaking Bread. And we wish you everything of the best with the work that you do. Godspeed and God's strength to you in everything that you do. And once again, thanks for giving us your time this evening.
Bye, Shukran.
Afwan. And so there you have it. We spoke to Professor Jonathan Jansen about Breaking Bread, his memoir, incredibly humbling, incredibly humble. And I think that this is a book that will make a great gift over the holidays, something to read, something to feel proud of as a South African, because here's someone whose contributions continue to carry as waves through our communities and through society. That's it from us this weekend on Book Bites, and that's it from me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.